any difference that you find in terms of that hub, and were there any definition issues with the concept of hub that perhaps we need to unpack a little bit more?
Yeah, I think it's a very important question. I want to follow up with what Jana has said about scale. I mean, if you look at different education hubs around the world, I would say Malaysia is perhaps physically the largest country undertaking such an initiative. So we can have lots of debates about, well, that, places like Qatar, UAE, Singapore, Hong Kong are in fact cities, and it's actually very easy for them to do. But when it comes to Malaysia, it is such a large country suddenly. You have to place your hub somewhere. Certainly at the policy level, Malaysia has pushed forward at the national level. As you know, national level policies exist, so that's great for us to do research on. But sometimes I think it's, assuming that there is a choice of whether or not we go small or we go big. The other places are all tiny, right? It's not really a choice for them. They don't have a choice of putting it in, a massive area like Johor, which has lots and lots of land. So I think the issue of scale and choice, how much agency is involved in such development is, we have to have a reflection on this. I think if you compare across Asia, Hong Kong, Singapore, again, tiny places, it's very easy for them to do. Mm-hmm. I would say the Malaysian case is perhaps more politicized, given, as you know, the entire private higher education and transnational education emerged out of frustrations by Chinese Malaysians seeking higher education and access. Yep. So that is fundamentally a very different origin than what Hong Kong or Singapore is eyeing in terms of greater, economic profits and modernization. That lens of politics in Malaysia is very, very strong. And even to today, I still feel it. Certainly Changda and William Lowe's article recently on TNE speaks again about local politics. I don't think it's possible to get away from that, particularly in the Malaysian case. Their hub idea is constantly driven by local politics. I also think the Malaysian case is perhaps more oriented towards student recruitment than deeper and more difficult decisions about what to do for a hub. Yeah. The Singaporeans are not simply recruiting, as you know. They want you to immigrate and settle and create a family. This is completely not the Malaysian ethos, which it's not a critique. It's fine if Malaysia wants to do that, but it's fundamentally a very different orientation.
Yeah. And would you say the Hong Kong and Singapore are pretty much a similar kind of direction they were going with what they would imagine to be a hub?
I think Singaporeans, as you know, are perhaps much more aggressive toward this idea. They put in a lot of resources, much more than Hong Kong. I think Hong Kong perhaps could be a fad, something they kind of embrace, thinking they did on policy identify it as one of the 6 policy pillars for Hong Kong to develop. So perhaps it's a fad, whereas for Singapore, I really think they view it as the future.
Mm-hmm. So the whole idea that was coming out it has some of the differences as Jana talked about earlier, that simple framework that we have, that trying to look at different kinds of hubs and that. But in reality, it's much more than, it's not so simple as a progression that we are a student hub, we go to a talent hub, and then we go into a knowledge hub. But it's much more fuzzy than that. But is that sufficient, or is there any other sort of framework from your work that can help us to understand this much better?
Right. I mean, certainly the interest in recruiting international students is widespread. I mean, that is certainly true across even places that don't call themselves as hubs. China has an international student target number. Japan had one. So my question would be, well, if you call yourself a hub, how are you fundamentally more different than a target for student recruitment, right? So I think the Singaporeans are pouring money into partnerships, actually physical construction of research centers with MIT, right? So this is serious institution building rather than simply recruiting students, right? Sending their students to, you know, these deep-rooted partnership programs like joint PhDs.
Correct. So is there any other examples? I think what the comparative examples that both of you have in your research project seems to be, Malaysia seems to be the only one that is having this imaginary hub, the whole system as a hub that we're trying to go into, right? Whereas the rest are more like education cities or special economic zones that is very much tied to the whole concept of international investment coming in, or like what Jack has just talked about, the collaboration of institutions with MIT or the recent Yale and US kind of collaboration, that nature of that kind of collaboration, but very much physical, tangible city or location that is, you can actually seize and feel things are moving with a physical hub. Would I be right to say that we were the only one that is talking about hub on two levels, where we are also talking about it at the imaginary policy level, trying to move the entire higher education system as if this is one hub per se? Would I be right to say that from your comparative?
I would maybe qualify it a little bit. It's an interesting provocation, but I think when I talk about the imaginary, it doesn't mean it's not true or it doesn't materialize in the physical, right? So it's the idea that this is something that people can rally around and sort of build support for, but at the same time, it can also be very fuzzy in many ways, right? So it's a guideline for policies, I would think, just like the knowledge economy, right? Everyone wants to have a knowledge economy, and everyone probably wouldn't mind being called an education hub, right? So I think we can see that in a number of different countries. I would say that in Singapore, it's also not necessarily the special economic zone character that matters, but it's also the similar strategy. And if I look at policy documents, whether they're from Dubai or Qatar or Malaysia or Singapore, in many ways they're interchangeable. If you were to delete the country, I think it would be very hard to say who wrote it. And I think there's a lot of copy and pasting in these strategies going on. I mean, you're surprised that they always mention their own country in the right spots in a way. So I think on that level, it's very similar. But then I think if we look at what are the actual preconditions, so what is the opportunity for a certain place to actually realize that strategy depends on longer standing histories, right? Like post-colonial engagements, on sort of the whole global landscape of higher education, on financial resources and so on. So I think that's when we see differences, not so much at the level of the strategy, which, yeah, it's hard to call a strategy because it's often sort of more aloof in terms of we have this grand shared goal, but actually how to get there then is different. And a key difference that I can see, or that I find interesting to ponder about what you mentioned earlier, is this idea of a ladder that you climb. So you start as a student hub and then talent hub, and then you sort of almost automatically, like modernization theory, you come to a takeoff phase and you're happily ever after. And I kind of, I'm probably past this kind of ladder thinking. And I think it's more about what structures are in place and what opportunities do you actually build. And there I would think that the Singaporean case, for instance, is way more strategic in exactly what Jack said, fostering these strategic partnerships and learning, and kind of, we see that also in China with joint venture policies for campuses. And I feel that often these strategies are very reflective of general foreign direct investment strategies. Yeah. So in a way, they slot in with previous experiences and with ideas on how you built an economy in a certain way. So for instance, if I look at the automotive industry in China, it's also the idea that you bring in foreign companies, but they're not allowed to operate by themselves. And there's a lot of strategic learning, let's say, that is going on. And after a while, these partnerships are cut. And the idea is that then the domestic player has gained all the knowledge that it required. And sort of the foreign partner can leave again. And in the Malaysian strategies, I see, with respect to higher education, what I see is more a strategy of, well, bring in the foreign players and they provide places for students, domestic or international. It's kind of like assembly platforms. So there's a foreign company that sets up a factory, and it brings in jobs. And for as long as it's there, it's good jobs maybe, and does its work. But once the company leaves and moves on to, let's say, a cheaper location or a more convenient location in many ways, or the favorable policies end and taxation starts, these companies are very footloose and able to leave again. And basically, the domestic actors are at the same place as they were before. And so to me, that is a key difference in terms of what I've been seeing in the Malaysian case. Is it's inviting foreign universities in, and they don't seem to engage in much domestic local partnerships with higher education institutions. So there are a lot of domestic partnerships, but these are with economic actors, big Malaysian firms. And so they're important for the capital generation and accumulation, but I don't think they're able to draw in that knowledge and then be able to run and develop university courses by themselves, let's say, right? They're more in the facility management side or other sides of the business sector.
Correct.
And so there's different kind of spillovers and learnings that can emerge from there. But it's a fundamentally different strategy. And I think the idea of, well, we discursively have the same policy ideals of an education hub, and thus we will sort of arrive at the same single point Singapore is at right now, just a couple of years later, to me is not so credible. And I think that's kind of where we could start thinking through sort of how are these actual steps to be taken. That to me would be interesting to think through. But now I talked so long that Doria took her hand down. So I hope
Doria, go ahead.
Still wants to add.
No, trying to rephrase the question, the question based on Jana's feedback. Actually, I agree with you that yes, there is a problem with seeing the hub concept as a progression from a student to a talent to a knowledge hub. At the start, when I was introduced to this concept, the innocent me says, yes, this is the way to go. But as you move along, you notice the complexities of managing it. Now, it's not a question. Okay, I think this is a conference statement, cliche statement. It's more of a observation, more like it. Last weekend, I attended a talk series by Tan Sri Azman Mokhtar. He's the former Hazanah National CEO. That particular Hazanah National is the brain behind concocting EduCity as a strategy for Malaysia. So he proudly highlights during that particular session that because of EduCity, the price of land increased 5 times since the beginning of the introduction. So the local me would say yes, at the expense of locals, because we can't go into the institutions. And at the same time, you have made you have built an unintended consequence in the sense that the housing is extremely expensive. The jobs are not mid to low tier anymore. You need to be an expert to be able to access a certain cluster of jobs in that area. So while I agree that is politically driven, it is still, for Malaysia sense, an economic angle that the main narrative is being anchored on. Reading is dying or dead already by now. Not so sure. The other one, Southampton, is flourishing surprisingly. Probably because of the focus of the industry over that side.
And also the nature of the way the institution is structured.
Yeah. Because and so my observation is that how do we move Malaysia forward, given that there's so many complexities involved. KLEC as a project died down. EduCity seems to be the one remaining standing. And with the border is still closing at the moment for international students, we don't know whether the Singaporeans are coming in or not, because this EduCity is still very proud of the fact that they're bringing in Singaporeans to study. So throwing it back is not a question.
Let me just clarify a few things. I was also doing a review of the EduCity a few years back. So I have the good fortune of visiting most of the institutions there. It's not true that the Singaporeans are coming in. 70% of the students are Johorians, actually. They have difficulties getting Singaporeans to come in, with the exception of one of the institution
Raffles?
in EduCity, not Raffles, but the other one, MDIS. Yeah, because they have very close connections to another Singaporean institution that offers degree programs for working professionals, people who have not gone to universities. They're coming back to do it as a sort of for them to upgrade themselves and to get a university degree, for those coming back with like the second chance education kind of institutions. So but as a whole, they are not bringing in students. But let's not go into that international borders and the COVID situation. I think that is the part. But before that, I think to add on to what Doria has talked about is that is this economic geographical concept of concentration of putting together institutions with the hope that they will create, they would benefit from the network and the mass, the scale of things, putting them together would bring benefit. But is this concept perhaps is for everyone in the room to maybe share your ideas? Is this as an education hub, is this concept, would this concept make sense by bringing all the institutions into the same physical location?
It can be done online, right? Imagine you
online.
Yeah.
Let's not bring in that online variable. that is perhaps the second part.
I mean, you wrote the report.
Just a minute before we continue.
Yeah, just what I wanted to say is that you wrote the report on EduCity that I read with great interest, and one of the sections that particularly spoke to me was how you described the fences and the almost military feel of sort of a fenced-in area within which institutions were located that had separate fences around them. And so if you walk around them, the level of permissions required to even move from A to B was sort of the most visible, sort of in the material environment, visible obstructions to this idea of collaboration in a way. And I mean, that doesn't have to be the case necessarily with education hubs, I think. But looking at the phenomenon of international branch campuses more broadly, I think what academics collaborate on is exactly what we're doing today. It's research, right? It's kind of exchanging knowledge and ideas. And there it's key, this idea you need this interaction. Doria, it can be done online. It can be done in multiple ways. But I think there's this innate need and interest to talk with scholars and colleagues, but often from within your own field. So the problem with the EduCity concept in many ways is that each institution is supposed to be responsible only for one field. Correct. So of course, the idea that we would now be talking to aeronautics specialists would be a bit random, right? We'd probably find something to talk about, but it's less obvious. But the more fundamental concern here, I think, is that what gets exported and what's part of the student hub idea in many ways is teaching only. Yep. So there's rarely any research taking place. And research, I think, is the moment for collaboration. And when I review the literature and also the policy documentation, there's always a slippage between the ideas of what universities, economic, because it's usually about the economic benefits of universities in regions. And then we look at spillovers, we look at human capital development, we look at research and innovation and patents and whatnot. And usually these ideas are borrowed from studying a place like the University of Manchester or the University of Bologna, and then you trace back 1,000 years. And of course, imagining the same kind of effects naturally occurring when you put in a fraction of the university and only 1 degree program, and only the teaching for that 1 degree program, and then maybe staff who's locally hired to teach this, then the kind of question of what kind of even imaginative spillovers can you anticipate from that? It becomes very, very difficult. And I think, to me, a key challenge with the EduCity project has been a very functionalist understanding of the role of higher education, in the sense that it's really one program that is tied to one, not even industry in some cases, but to one other firm. And so the idea that this almost like a supplier idea, this university will supply the input, namely the labor, who's required to work in the film studios. And then if the film studios start to disinvest, the entire university branch campus can close down because there's no need anymore. And so in that sense, you're always running behind the target. In many ways, you always try to put something in place to support something that's already there, but then that's leaving. And so you're never ahead of things, basically. And it's is there any other sort of models that you can perhaps share on that sense? Because when you talk about the interaction and all this, it's clearly not happening in at least in that example of EduCity, or I would presume that would be the case if we begin to even, let's say we reimagine that we're going to have another physical education hub that we bring different institutions together, giving them, because it's fundamentally premised on everyone is talking about bringing in international students, bringing in students, and seeing the universities in there fundamentally as teaching universities. Right, and you were absolutely right. When I was doing my PhD in the UK, it was in a university city. The university basically do not exist, do not even have boundaries, right? You can just walk into any other buildings and then you realize this building belongs to one of the colleges. And the colleges are not in competition of each other, right? They are not in competition of the students, right? And they bring in students from different disciplines and all this, and that gives that interaction, the academic interaction with that, you are able to meet people from different
fields, different disciplines, working with different things, comes together. And you have that free flow of interaction. That would make sense in a city or in a borderless kind of campus, perhaps.